Like that of the Marne, the popular story of the great German victory of Tannenberg is a monument of monumental error. For it consists, actually, of a figure of wood on a pedestal of clay, varnished with legend. The first and most popular of these legends provided a romantic picture of an old general who, as the hobby of his years of retirement, spent his time in devising a gigantic trap for a future Russian invasion, exploring paths through and sounding the bottom of the marshes in which the Russian hordes were to be engulfed, and then, when war came, carrying his dream to fulfillment. The next legend, which rose as the shadow of Ludendorff rose behind the figure of Hindenburg, was of a masterly plan for a second canny conceived and dictated in the train that was carrying Ludendorff to pick up his nominal master, en route to East Prussia. History, alas, must dissipate both. For the Germans, essentially a people of combination, found their gallieni in a conjunction between the brain of a young staff officer and the drive of an old corps commander. And they, in turn, were much helped because Russian leadership was able to combine the faults of a Moltke and a Joffre. Indeed, the military history of modern Russia is epitomized in the brief record of the invasion of East Prussia. The man who was, in large measure, responsible for the blundering execution was also responsible for that disastrous invasion being made, and being made before the Russian forces were ready. This was General Jelinsky, who had been chief of the General Staff until 1913. For he had made the military convention with France, whereby Russia was pledged to put 800,000 men in the field on the 15th day of mobilization. This arrangement put a strain on the cumbrous Russian war machine, which caused numerous cracks and local failures when it began moving. And it also put a strain on the Russian headquarters staff, which led them to make decisions in a state of nervous flurry. But the arrangement did not end with this promise, for the new plan envisaged an offensive against the Germans simultaneously with the main thrust against the Austrians. To increase the drawbacks, the plan was to be carried out by a man who had not worked it out. Who had even been deprived deliberately of any influence upon it by General Sukhomlinov, the Minister of War. Sukhomlinov, indeed, was scheming to get command himself. But he was not the only one who had a belief in his own divine fitness for command. And his rival claimed divine right. For when the war came, the Tsar proposed to take command himself, to the alarm of his ministers. Under pressure from them, the Tsar regretfully appointed the Grand Duke Nicholas, who was at least a trained soldier, but handicapped him by nominating his two principal assistants. One of these, Yanushkevich, was a courtier general, unpopular with the working army. The second, Danilov, was an able but orthodox soldier and really directed the Russian strategy. From the earliest days of August, the Grand Duke was incessantly pressed by the French, through the Russian Foreign Office, to do something to relieve the German pressure on the French, and to do it quickly. Thereby, although the Russian invasion of East Prussia did not begin before the promised time, it began before it was ready. East Prussia formed a long tongue of land pointing across the Niemen River to the heart of Russia and flanked on the north by the Baltic and on the south by Russian Poland. Along the land frontier, two armies had been assembled, the first Vilno Army under Rennenkampf and the second Warsaw Army under Samsonov. The two formed a group under the higher control of Jelinsky. His plan was that Rennenkampf should advance against the eastern tip of East Prussia, drawing upon himself the German defending forces. Then, 2 days later, Samsonov was to cross the southern frontier and bestride the Germans' rear, cutting them off from the Vistula. The fault of this plan lay not in the conception but in the execution. Its potential value was well proved by the alarm, indeed, the dislocation of mind caused in the German headquarters when the menace was disclosed. But it suffered two natural handicaps, apart from faulty leadership and military unreadiness. The first was that the two armies were separated by the 50-mile chain of the Masurian Lakes. These also, in conjunction with the fortified Königsberg area on the west, narrowed Rennenkampf's line of advance to a gap only about 40 miles wide. Secondly, the Russians' own invasion from the south was now to be handicapped by the fact that they had left the border country a desert, with poor railways and worse roads, as a barrier against a German invasion. On August 17, Rennenkampf crossed the eastern frontier with 6.5 divisions and 5 cavalry divisions. The problem of meeting such a double thrust had long been studied, and Schlieffen's solution had been that of utilizing the obstacles of the county, especially the Masurian lakes, to strike hard and with full strength at whichever Russian army first came within reach, and then to turn against the other. But Prittwitz, the commander in East Prussia, was akin to his superior, Moltke, in his fear of taking calculated risks. Unwilling to rely on landwehr and garrison troops to supplement natural obstacles in delaying Samsonov, he also left the 2 divisions of the 20th Corps, Schultz, on the southern front. The remainder of his 8th Army, 7 divisions and 1 cavalry division, concentrated to oppose Rennenkampf. And, to handicap himself further in gaining quick and decisive results, he launched a frontal attack on the invaders, owing to a mistaken idea of their position. This attack was delivered near Gumbinnen on August 20. The German Center Corps, the XVII Mackensen, had to deliver the most straightforward attack and suffered a heavy repulse, which offset at least psychologically the success of the corps on either wing. Even so, Rennenkampf was on the point of ordering a retreat to save his own center from encirclement when, next morning, he found that the Germans were retreating instead. For on the day of Gumbinnen, Samsonov had reached the frontier, so hurried on by Jelinski, that his troops were tired and hungry, their transport incomplete and the supply services in chaos. He had with him 8 divisions and 3 cavalry divisions, while 2 more divisions were following on. His appearance was reported by the 20th Corps to Prittwitz, and his force was rather under than overestimated. Prittwitz was unnerved by the news, although the 20th Corps was not. That evening 2 of his staff, General Grunert and Lieutenant Colonel Max Hoffmann, were talking outside their office in the headquarters at Niedenberg, uncomfortably close to the southern frontier, when Prittwitz appeared and called them into his office. There also was the Chief of Staff, Count Waldersee, another wavering bearer of a famous name. With anxiety writ on his face, Prittwitz said, "I suppose, gentlemen, you also have received this fresh news from the southern front. The army is breaking off the battle and retiring behind the Vistula." Both the junior staff officers protested, urging that the Gumbinnen thrust should first be driven home, that there was adequate time, and that, in any case, a precipitate retreat without fighting would give Samsonov, who was much nearer the Vistula, the chance to cut off the main German forces. Prittwitz, however, curtly told them that the decision rested with him and not with them. He then left the office, leaving them to continue the argument with Waldersee and, eventually, to persuade him to take bolder measures. It was decided that, to gain time and room, an attack should be launched against Samsonov's left or western flank. And for this purpose 3 divisions should be railed back from the Gumbinnen area to reinforce the 20th Corps, while the remainder of the force there, I Reserve and 17th Corps, were to retreat westwards by road. Here was the foundation of the Tannenberg maneuver. On returning to the office, Prittwitz agreed to their moves and spoke no more of retiring behind the Vistula. Next day he grew quite cheerful when word came that his forces had been disengaged safely from Rennenkampf's front and that Samsonov had almost come to a standstill. But on the 22nd, when the headquarters had been moved north to Molassen, a bombshell was exploded by a telegram which announced that a special train was on its way with a new commander-in-chief and a new chief of staff on board, the first being General von Hindenburg and the second, General Ludendorff. Half an hour after came the delayed telegram which told Prittwitz and Waldersee that they had been superseded. Not until later did the astonished staff discover the clue to this dramatic upset. It lay in the fact that while Prittwitz was out of the office during the discussion on the 20th, he had not only telephoned to Mackensen and to the lines of communication authorities to tell them that he was going to retire behind the Vistula, but had telephoned also to the Supreme Command then at Koblenz on the Rhine. He had even told Moltke that he could only hold the Vistula line if he received reinforcements. To crown his nerve-broken folly, he forgot to tell his staff of this telephone talk when he came back and so prevented them informing Moltke of his change of plan. and Moltke, whose own loss of nerve and lapse into pessimism were still to come, though imminent, was remarkably quick to penalize it in a subordinate. He looked round at once for a man of decision and found him in Ludendorff, who had just wrenched victory from defeat at Liege. Then as an afterthought, he chose a nominal superior for Ludendorff, who was summoned to Koblenz. Arriving there on the 22nd, he had the situation in East Prussia explained to him, dispatched his initial orders direct to the unfortunate Prittwitz's corps commanders, caught the train for his new command, and picked up his commander, Hindenburg, at Hanover. Let us pause to contemplate this delightful and amusing picture of the German system of command. The staff officer chosen first and alone consulted, while the figurehead waits unclaimed in the lost property office at Hanover. The staff officer telegraphing his orders and then collecting his baggage on the way. But the supreme jest was that the plan had already been framed and the necessary movements made by a still more junior staff officer, Hoffmann, who was to remain under Ludendorff in his post as head of the operations branch. The calculated daring of the plan, moreover, owed much to an earlier experience of Hoffmann's. For Schlieffen, with discerning insight, had picked this impishly brilliant young captain, whom many deemed merely a witty flaneur, to go as observer with the Japanese forces in the war against Russia. There he learned much about the Russian army, and not least a story that two generals, Rennenkampf and Samsonov, had boxed each other's ears on the railway platform at Mukden. Thus, in his judgment, Rennenkampf would be in no hurry to aid Samsonov by pressing on from Gumbinnen. He had also learnt in Manchuria the incredible carelessness of Russian methods, and this knowledge led him in August 1914 to accept the intercepted Russian wireless orders, sent out in clear, as authentic, whereas his seniors were distrustfully inclined to regard them as an artful deception. Paradoxically, the fulfillment of Hoffmann's plan and its development by Ludendorff, the plan on which Ludendorff was to rise to world fame, were hindered by Ludendorff's initial orders. For, in order to amputate Prittwitz's control, Ludendorff had telephoned from Koblenz to the several army corps, telling them to act independently until he arrived. The I Reserve and 17th Corps on Rennenkampf's front utilized this order to take a day's rest in their retreat westwards. Another check on rapidity was that the whole of the 8th Army headquarters had to move back to Marienburg to meet the new commanders. On arrival there on the 23rd, Ludendorff was pleasantly surprised to find that the movements already in progress fitted in with his own half-formed plan, and he confirmed Hoffmann's arrangements. Next day it became clearer that Rennenkampf was not moving forward in pursuit, and Ludendorff enlarged the plan by accelerating the retirement of the I Reserve Corps below, so that it could strike Samsonov's right flank. Then, on the 25th, intercepted wireless messages showed him the slowness of Rennenkampf's movements, and he began to think that he could use the 17th Corps, Mackensen, also, leaving only the cavalry to watch and hoodwink Rennenkampf. Thereby he might strike hard at not one but both of Samsonov's flanks and bring off a decisive double envelopment. Unfortunately for his now matured plan, even forced marches could not overtake the lost day of rest. Samsonov meantime had been staggering forward, driven on by telegraphic lashes from Jelinsky, who had jumped to the conclusion that the Germans were doing what Prittwitz had contemplated, retreating to the Vistula. And in driving Samsonov on to cut them off, Jelinsky not only neglected to hasten Rennenkampf, but even diverted his energy by orders to invest Königsberg. Meantime Samsonov's army was spread out over a front of nearly 60 miles, and his right, center and left were widely separated. If they had been linked by mobility, this width might have been an advantage, but with sluggish troops and bad roads, it became a danger. And an attempt to sidestep farther west as he advanced led through self-dislocation to self-destruction. Schulz's 20th Corps had been slowly giving way and wheeling back westwards before the advance of the Russian center, She and 15th Corps, towards the line Allenstein-Osterode. Fearing both the strain and the effect of a further retirement, Ludendorff ordered François' 1st Corps to attack on the 26th and break through the Russian left wing, 1st Corps and 2 cavalry divisions, near Uzdau. Francois protested that part of his troops, 3/4 of his field guns, all his heavy guns, and his ammunition columns had not yet arrived. He also urged that instead of making a frontal attack, he should get round the Russian flank. Ludendorff summarily overrode these objections. His sense of time was perhaps greater than his sense of tactical reality. But Francois, who had no wish to repeat Mackinson's experience at Gumbinnen, avoided the Russians' active resistance by passive resistance to Ludendorff's orders and contented himself with the capture of an outlying ridge. And any danger to Schulz's 20th Corps was avoided by the inactivity of Samsonov's exhausted troops. One corps, for example, had marched more than 150 miles in 12 days over roads that were merely deep sand. But the 26th did not pass without hard fighting. For away on the other flank the Russian right wing, 6th Corps and Cavalry Division, separated by 2 days' march distance from the rest of the army, had encountered near Laudern the 2 German corps that were marching back from the East Front. The Russian right wing was thrown back in confusion, but the attacks of Below and Mackinson were badly coordinated. Their troops were tired by the forced marches, and they did not press the pursuit. Thus the Russian right wing, although disorganized, was able to retire safely. Part of one division, however, had been hemmed in with their backs to the Basse Lake, and in the panic a number were drowned. From this small incident arose the legend that Hindenburg had driven Samsonov's army into the lakes and marshes, drowning thousands. The real crisis of the battle, as a whole, came on the 27th. For that morning Francois, now amply supplied with shells, opened a fierce bombardment on the position of the Russian left wing near Uzdau. The Russian troops could not stand high explosive on top of an empty stomach, and they broke in flight without waiting for the German infantry. Francois ordered the pursuit to be made towards Nedenburg to get across the rear of the Russian center, but a Russian counterattack against his outer flank caused him to wheel south towards Soldau. At daybreak on the 28th, however, he discovered that the beaten Russian left wing had retired precipitately from Soldau across the frontier, and he once more turned his forces eastwards to Nedenburg. The time that he had lost on the 27th was compensated for by the fact that the Russians had engulfed themselves still farther to their doom. For although Samsonov knew the night before that his right had been beaten and his left was menaced, he had ordered his center to strike northward again. As he can be acquitted of undue optimism, there are 2 possible explanations: that he was too rigidly loyal to his orders in trying to carry out his mission, or that he was unwilling to retreat when Rennenkampf, his old enemy, was advancing. His attack probably saved the Germans a repulse, for Schulz had been ordered by Ludendorff to chime in after Francois' attack. As it was, the Russian center made several cracks in Schulz's front, although at the price of further exhaustion to itself. These cracks seemed to have momentarily cracked Ludendorff's nerve, for he ordered Francois both to send back assistance and, with the rest of his corps, to march northeast towards Lana, against the immediate rear of the Russian center. This direction, which traversed thick forest country, would have given Francois less time and chance to bar the Russian line of retreat. Fortunately, he again disregarded his orders and continued towards Nedenburg. Soon after midday Ludendorff discovered that the Russians were not attempting to deepen the cracks, but, rather, were showing signs of retreat. So he sent Francois fresh orders not only to move on Nedenburg but through it, eastward on Willenburg. And by the night of the 29th, Francois's troops held the road from Nedenburg to Willenburg, with a chain of entrenched posts between, forming a barricade across the line of retreat of the Russians who were now flowing back and becoming inextricably mixed in the forest maze which Francois had avoided. With its rear closed and its roads congested, the Russian center, Xi, XV and half the 23rd Corps, dissolved into a mob of hungry and exhausted men who beat feebly against the ring of fire and then let themselves be rounded up in thousands. The crowning scene of the tragedy was enacted by Samsonov himself, who had moved up from Nedenburg on the 27th to control the battle, only to find himself caught up in the swirling eddies of the retreat. Unable to do anything, he turned and rode south again on the 28th, only to get lost in the depths of the forest. In the darkness he turned aside, and his absence was unnoticed by his staff, until a solitary shot rang out he had taken his own life, rather than survived the disaster. But when he died, the disaster was not so complete as his despair, nor so certain. If the Russian center had only been able to reorganize the cause of Francois' weakness, however, and the escape of part of Samsonov's army, was due to the failure of Mackensen and Below from the east to join up with Francois. Thus the barricade was neither as firm nor as complete as it might have been. Owing to faulty cooperation between Mackensen and Below, and lack of clear guidance from above, their corps abandoned the pursuit of the Russian right wing and turned northwards towards Allenstein, marching, in good German style, to the sound of the guns, instead of weaving a net round the enemy's rear in Hannibalic style. Ludendorff, divided between fear of Rennenkampf's advance and his desire to annihilate Samsonov, issued a contradictory series of orders which did not help to sort out the tangle into which Mackensen and Below had got their forces. In the outcome, he thereby risked more and gained less. For he took longer to close up his battle accounts and left a gap in the southeast through which part of the Russian 13th Corps actually escaped, and most of it might have escaped if Mackensen, on his own initiative, had not turned southwards again in an effort to close the gap, and the Russians had not been blinded by panic. Nevertheless, 92,000 prisoners were taken, 2.5 army corps annihilated, and the other half of Samsonov's army severely shaken, especially in morale. The Germans were certainly favored by the enemy's folly above all, in dispersing the fog of war at intervals by unciphered wireless messages. Yet if we make due allowance for these flashes of light, we should take due account of the blindness and the difficulties of this wild region. The victory of Tannenberg remains a great achievement, as it was a unique one in the history of the war. But Ludendorff was not the designer of victory, and still less Hindenburg. To Hoffmann is due the chief credit of the design, if Prittwitz and Ludendorff have some share for accepting it in turn, and Ludendorff also for certain additions of detail. Nor was Ludendorff even the agent of victory, for Francois' share was the most essential. And against Ludendorff's share must be offset the fact that his original telegram from Koblenz was the original and echoing cause of the failure to complete Samsonov's encirclement. For the Battle of Tannenberg was not a second canny, deliberately planned, as it has so often been acclaimed. The aim was to break the force of the Russian invasion, and not to surround the Russian army, and the idea of the double envelopment only an afterthought, which became possible of fulfillment when Rennenkampf continued to remain passive. As much an afterthought as the very name given to the victory. For Ludendorff's order for the pursuit on the 28th had been headed Frauenau, when Hoffmann suggested that he